New Year's Eve in Manhattan is a glittering nightmare if you are entirely alone. Vivienne possessed $3 billion, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and absolute power. But tonight, her money couldn't buy a single seat at a crowded table. Turned away by a smug maitre d' while the world celebrated, she was ready to vanish into the freezing snow. Then, from a dimly lit corner booth, a financially ruined single father stood up, smiled, and waved her over. The Bloomberg terminal on Vivienne Croft's mahogany desk blinked with a relentless stream of green numbers, a digital testament to her invincibility. It was 6 p.m. on December 31st. The rest of New York City was already uncorking champagne, donning velvet jackets, and crowding into taxis bound for extravagant parties. But on the 58th floor of the 157 Tower, the headquarters of Omnicore Global, the silence was absolute. Vivienne sat back in her Herman Miller chair, staring at the reflection of the Manhattan skyline in the floor-to-ceiling glass. At 34, she was the youngest female logistics and supply chain billionaire in the world. Forbes had called her the architect of the modern supply line, a woman who could reroute cargo ships across the Pacific with a single phone call. She was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly, profoundly isolated. Ms. Croft? Vivienne blinked, turning her head to see her executive assistant, David, standing in the doorway. He was wearing his coat, a thick wool scarf wrapped around his neck, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He looked guilty, like a soldier abandoning his general, even though Vivienne had explicitly told the entire executive floor to go home at noon. "Yes, David, you're still here." Her voice was smooth, betraying none of the hollow ache that had been growing in her chest all afternoon. I was just finishing the final compliance reports for the Q4 acquisitions," David said, holding up a sleek leather briefcase. "My fiancé is waiting at Grand Central, so I'm going to head out. Are you sure you don't need anything else? I can have the driver bring the Maybach around if you're heading to the Hamptons." "No, thank you," Vivienne replied, offering a tight, practiced smile. "I'm staying in the city tonight. Go. Enjoy your evening. Happy New Year, David." "Happy New Year, Ms. Croft." As the heavy glass door clicked shut, the silence rushed back into the room, louder than before. Vivienne looked down at her hands. She wore a platinum Cartier tank watch and a bespoke charcoal suit tailored by Tom Ford. But the armor felt heavy today. Over the last 12 months, she had doubled her company's valuation, orchestrated a ruthless hostile takeover of a rival engineering firm in October, and secured a government defense contract. She had won every battle. Yet, as she looked at her phone, the screen was devoid of personal notifications. There were no texts from friends asking where she was. There were no missed calls from a lover. Her parents had passed away a decade ago, leaving her a modest inheritance that she had spun into an empire, but taking with them the only unconditional love she had ever known. She couldn't stay in the office. The sterile perfection of it was suffocating. Vivienne powered down the terminal, grabbed her camel hair Loro Piana coat, and took the private elevator down to the street. Stepping out onto West 57th Street, the freezing wind bit into her cheeks. The city was alive with a frantic, joyous energy. Couples hurried past her, clutching bottles of Veuve Clicquot in brown paper bags, laughing into each other's shoulders. The neon lights of Columbus Circle bled onto the wet pavement, reflecting a world she felt entirely separated from. She walked, not caring that the slush was ruining her Christian Louboutin boots. She felt a sudden, desperate craving to be around people, to hear the clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversation, to feel the warmth of human proximity. She realized she was hungry, not just for food, but for an anchor to reality. She found herself standing outside Jean-Georges, the 3 Michelin-starred institution at the base of the Trump International Hotel. It was a place she frequently used for power lunches, where the staff knew her by name and usually bent over backward to accommodate her. The windows were frosted at the edges, glowing with a warm, amber light. Inside, elegantly dressed patrons were already beginning their evening. Pushing through the heavy brass doors, Vivienne stepped into the lobby, unbuttoning her coat. The air smelled intoxicatingly of black truffles, brown butter, and expensive perfume. "Good evening, madame," a crisp voice called out. It was Pascal, the formidable head maitre d'. He stood behind his podium, dressed in a flawless tuxedo. His silver hair slicked back. He looked up, his professional smile faltering for a microsecond as he recognized her. "Ms. Croft, what a... surprised to see you this evening." "Hello, Pascal," Vivienne said, projecting the easy confidence she used in boardrooms. "No, it's terribly last minute, but I find myself in the city unexpectedly. I'd love a table for one, if you can manage it. Just a quick dinner." Pascal's posture stiffened. He looked at the iPad in front of him, though Vivienne knew he didn't need to. "Ms. Croft, I am profoundly apologetic. Tonight is our New Year's Eve gala tasting menu. It is an exclusively pre-ticketed event. We have been fully committed for 6 months." "I understand," Vivienne said, her voice lowering. "But surely there is a cancellation, a no-show, even a seat at the bar. I am happy to pay the full gala price, of course." Pascal clasped his hands in front of him, his expression hardening into a mask of polite refusal. In the world of elite New York dining, turning away a billionaire on a technicality was a rare power trip. "I am afraid the bar is reserved for our VIP ticket holders awaiting their tables. We literally do not have a single chair available. Ms. Croft, had your office called even this morning, I might have attempted a miracle. But tonight, it is impossible. I am truly sorry." Behind Vivienne, a couple wrapped in mink and cashmere pushed into the vestibule, laughing loudly. "Excuse us, reservation for Vanderbilt," the man boomed. Pascal instantly beamed. "Ah, Mr. Vanderbilt, right this way." Vivienne was forced to step aside, pressing her back against the cold glass of the coat check window. She stood there, exposed and humiliated. In the span of 3 minutes, her billions had been rendered entirely useless. She was just a lonely woman standing in the way of other people's happiness. A sharp sting of rejection hit her eyes. It was a foolish, petty thing to cry over a restaurant table. But it wasn't about the table. It was about the fact that she had nowhere else to go, and no one to go with. She tightened the belt of her coat, preparing to walk back out into the freezing snow, resigning herself to a night of ordering room service in her empty penthouse. "Vivienne, my God, Vivienne, is that you?" The voice cut through the ambient jazz and the clatter of silver like a lifeline. It was deep, warm, and entirely unfamiliar. Vivienne froze, her hand resting on the brass handle of the exit door. She turned around slowly, seated at a small, slightly cramped table in the far corner of the dining room. A table usually reserved for overflow or less important guests, was a man standing up, waving his napkin enthusiastically in her direction. He was in his mid-30s, with tired but striking hazel eyes, a strong jawline shadowed by a day's worth of stubble, and dark hair that looked like it had been run through by his fingers one too many times. He was wearing a Brooks Brothers suit that fit well but lacked the bespoke sheen of the men surrounding him. The cuffs of his shirt were slightly frayed. Beside him, kneeling on her chair and peering over the white tablecloth, was a little girl of about 7. She was wearing a sequined pink dress that looked like it came from Target. A plastic tiara perched crookedly on her head, and she was busy arranging a set of crayons next to a bone china bread plate. Vivienne stared at the man. She searched her eidetic memory. A former employee, a junior partner at a law firm, a venture capitalist. She drew a complete blank. She had never seen this man in her life. "Over here, we've been waiting for you," the man called out again, his smile wide and convincing. Pascal, the maitre d', paused mid-stride as he was leading the Vanderbilts to their table. He looked from the man in the corner back to Vivienne, his perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Ms. Croft, are you joining Mr. Pendelton?" Vivienne's mind raced. If she said no, she would have to walk out into the cold, cementing her humiliation. The man's eyes met hers across the room. There was no mockery in his gaze, only a quiet, urgent kindness. He was throwing her a rope. "Yes," Vivienne lied, her voice steady and smooth. She let go of the door handle. "Yes, I'm sorry. Pascal, I didn't want to presume they had arrived yet. My mistake." Pascal blinked, clearly thrown off balance, but the ironclad rules of hospitality demanded he accept the fiction. "I see. My apologies. Ms. Croft, let me take your coat." Vivienne slipped out of her Loro Piana coat, handing it to the coat check attendant. She took a deep breath, smoothing her charcoal suit, and walked across the plush carpet toward the corner table. Every step felt surreal. She was the woman who calculated risk to the 7th decimal point. And here she was, walking blindly into a charade with a complete stranger. As she reached the table, the man stepped out and pulled out the empty third chair for her. As she sat down, he leaned in, the faint scent of sandalwood and winter air washing over her. "Just play along," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "I saw how he was looking at you. Nobody deserves to be left out in the cold tonight." Vivienne sat down, her heart beating an erratic rhythm against her ribs. "Thank you," she breathed, barely moving her lips. The man sat back down across from her, his broad smile returning. "Vivienne, it's so good to see you. It's been ages. I'm Felix Pendelton, and this," he gestured proudly to the little girl beside him, "is my daughter, Mia." Mia looked up from her crayons, her big brown eyes studying Vivienne with unabashed curiosity. "Hi," she piped up, her voice high and sweet. "Are you Daddy's friend from the big buildings?" Vivienne swallowed the knot in her throat. She looked at the little girl, then at Felix. Yes, Mia. I am. It is very lovely to meet you. I love your crown." Mia beamed, adjusting the plastic tiara. "Daddy said I could be a princess tonight because it's a special occasion." "We're eating fancy food," Felix chuckled, a sound that carried a heavy, hidden exhaustion, but his eyes were bright as he looked at his daughter. "That we are, Bug, that we are." A waiter materialized beside them, pouring sparkling water into Vivienne's crystal goblet. "Good evening, Madame. Will you be joining the table for the New Year's tasting menu?" Felix shifted slightly in his chair. Vivienne noticed a brief flash of panic in his eyes. She immediately understood. This restaurant was astronomically expensive, at $500 a head for the holiday menu. A third person was a financial torpedo to a man whose shirt cuffs were fraying. "Actually," Vivienne interjected smoothly before Felix could speak, "I had a massive late lunch. I couldn't possibly eat a full menu, but I would love to order a bottle of wine for the table, and perhaps I'll steal a few bites of whatever Felix is having." The waiter nodded seamlessly. "Of course, Madame. I will bring the wine list." Once the waiter retreated, Felix leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You really didn't have to do that," he said softly. "You can order whatever you want. I invited you." "Felix," Vivienne said, her voice taking on a softer tone than she had used in years. "You just saved me from the most embarrassing exit of my adult life. Please let me handle the wine. It's the least I can do." "I saw the way that guy at the front looked at you," Felix said, shaking his head. "Like you were asking for a handout. People in these places, they forget how to be human sometimes." "How did you get a table?" Vivienne asked, genuinely curious. Pascal wasn't lying. This place is notoriously impossible on New Year's. Felix smiled, looking down at his water glass. "I used to do some freelance graphic design work for the restaurant group that owns this place. Built their reservation portal a few years back. The manager owed me a favor. I cashed it in tonight. Mia and I. We've had a rough year. I promised her we'd do something magical to ring in the new one." Vivienne looked around the opulent dining room, then back at Felix and Mia. She felt a profound sense of intrusion, realizing she had crashed the most important night of this small family's year. "Felix, I shouldn't be here. This is your special night with your daughter. I can slip out the side door. Pascal won't even notice." "No," Felix said firmly, reaching across the table. He didn't touch her, but his hand hovered near hers. "Stay. Honestly, it's nice to have some grown-up conversation. Besides, Mia was just telling me how boring I am." "Right, Lil?" Mia didn't look up from her drawing. "You talk about concrete too much, Daddy." Felix laughed, a genuine, chest-deep sound. "See? I've been vetoed by the princess. You have to stay. Vivienne, consider it a favor to me." Vivienne looked at his hand, large and calloused, resting on the white linen. For the first time in a decade, she didn't want to run back to her office. She took a breath, letting her shoulders drop, and nodded. "Okay, I'll stay." The atmosphere at the table shifted, a fragile bridge of trust forming over the white linen. The sommelier arrived, and Vivienne, deliberately avoiding the five-figure vintages she usually selected, ordered a modest but excellent Chateau Neuf du Pape. When the first course arrived, a delicate Kumamoto oyster topped with caviar and a Meyer lemon foam, Mia stared at it with profound suspicion. "Is it a booger?" she asked loudly, pointing her crayon at the shell. A couple at the next table, dripping in diamonds, turned to glare. Vivienne, who had spent the last 10 years agonizing over PR optics and projecting flawless sophistication, surprised herself by letting out a sudden, unladylike snort of laughter. "No, sweetie," Felix sighed, massaging his temples while smiling. "It's an oyster. It's a delicacy. Remember we talked about trying new things." Mia poked the caviar with her fork. "It looks like tiny black eyeballs." "Tell you what," Vivienne said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I will eat the eyeballs if you promise to eat the bread." Mia considered this trade pact with the gravity of a boardroom negotiation. She looked at Vivienne, then at the basket of warm brioche. "Deal," she said, extending a tiny, crayon-smudged hand. Vivienne shook it solemnly. The touch of the child's small, warm hand sent an unfamiliar jolt straight to Vivienne's chest. It was a stark reminder of everything her billions couldn't buy. She watched Felix carefully cut a piece of brioche and butter it for his daughter. There was an effortless devotion in his movements, a quiet, fierce love that radiated from him. As the dinner progressed through courses of butter-poached lobster and truffle risotto, Vivienne found herself opening up in ways she never did. She didn't tell him she was a billionaire. She simply said she worked in logistics, managing supply chains. "Ah, a problem solver," Felix said, taking a sip of the red wine. "You figure out how to get things from point A to point B without them falling apart." "Huh, something like that," Vivienne replied, swirling her glass. "It's a lot of putting out fires." "What about you? Mia said you talk about concrete." Felix's smile tightened slightly, a shadow crossing his hazel eyes. "I'm a structural engineer, or I specialize in load-bearing architectures for large-scale commercial retrofits. I make sure old buildings don't collapse when you put new, heavy tech inside them." "That sounds incredibly complex," Vivienne noted. "Why did you say was?" Felix glanced at Mia, who was happily gnawing on a piece of lobster, completely engrossed in drawing a sprawling cityscape on the back of a spare menu the waiter had kindly provided. He lowered his voice. "My firm was bought out a few months ago," Felix said quietly, the exhaustion seeping back into his tone. "It was a hostile takeover. Some massive conglomerate swooped in, bought all our proprietary patents for retrofitting, and then liquidated the staff. They didn't care about the people. They just wanted our intellectual property." Vivienne felt a strange prickle at the back of her neck. The wine suddenly tasted like ash. "That happens often in corporate restructuring. What was the name of your firm?" "Hudson and Gable," Felix said, tracing the rim of his glass. "Based over in Brooklyn. I was with them for 10 years. Helped build it from the ground up." The blood in Vivienne's veins turned to ice. She stopped breathing for a second, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass so tightly it threatened to shatter. Hudson and Gable. In October, Omnicore Global had launched a silent subsidiary shell company named Apex Holdings to aggressively acquire a Brooklyn-based engineering firm. They needed the firm's specific, load-bearing patents to secure the structural integrity of Omnicore's new drone dispatch warehouses. Vivienne had signed the authorization herself on a Tuesday morning while sipping a matcha latte. The spreadsheet had shown 140 employees. She had highlighted the column, pressed delete, and authorized the severance packages. It was a strategic masterstroke that had bumped Omnicore's stock price by 4%. She was looking into the eyes of one of the numbers she had deleted. I'm so sorry. Felix," Vivienne managed to choke out. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. She felt physically sick. The man who had just saved her from utter humiliation. The man who was spending his meager savings to give his daughter one magical night. She had destroyed his life from a leather chair 58 stories in the air. "It's not your fault," Felix chuckled bitterly, misinterpreting her shock as simple empathy. "That's just how the world works, right? The big fish eat the little fish. These CEOs, these billionaires, they don't see us. We're just lines on a balance sheet. They don't see that when they sign a piece of paper. A guy like me has to explain to his daughter why we have to move out of our apartment before Christmas." Vivienne felt a tear prick her eye, burning like acid. She blinked it away desperately. "You had to move?" "Yeah," Felix sighed, looking down at his hands. "My wife, Mia's mom. She left us a couple of years ago. Couldn't handle the stress of motherhood. So it's just been me and Lil. We had a great little place in Park Slope. But after the layoff, I couldn't make rent. We're in a studio in Queens now. I've been taking freelance design gigs just to keep the heat on." He looked up, suddenly embarrassed, and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. Vivienne, I didn't mean to dump all this on you. Tonight is supposed to be a celebration. New year, new start, right?" "Right," Vivienne whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at Mia. The little girl had finished her drawing and slid it across the table toward Vivienne. It was a drawing of a bridge, colored in bright blue and red crayons. Standing on the bridge were 3 stick figures, a tall one, a little one with a crown, and a third figure in a gray suit. "I drew you," Mia said proudly, pointing a buttery finger at the gray stick figure. "You're on the bridge with us." Vivienne stared at the child's drawing. The innocence of it, ripping through her iron-clad defenses. She had spent her entire adult life building walls, acquiring power to ensure no one could ever hurt her. No one could ever reject her. But sitting at this table, looking at the devastation she had unknowingly caused to a man who had shown her nothing but grace. Her walls were crumbling. She needed to leave. She needed to tell him the truth. She needed to write him a check for $1 million. She didn't know what to do. The panic was rising in her throat, thick and suffocating. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, to confess everything, the lights in the restaurant suddenly dimmed. A hush fell over the dining room as Pascal stepped to the center of the floor, a microphone in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pascal's voice echoed smoothly through the room. "In just 60 seconds, we will welcome the new year. Please, raise your glasses." The waitstaff moved seamlessly through the tables, pouring golden champagne into flutes. Felix lifted his glass, a gentle, hopeful smile on his face. He nudged his glass against Mia's apple juice. "To new beginnings, bug," he said softly. He then turned to Vivienne, holding his glass out toward her. "And to unexpected friends, Vivienne. I'm glad you didn't leave." Vivienne stared at the bubbles rising in her crystal flute. The clock was ticking down. 10 seconds. 9. 8. She clinked her glass against his, the sound ringing like a funeral bell in her ears. "To unexpected friends," she lied, her heart breaking as the room erupted into cheers. The dawn of New Year's Day broke over Manhattan in a wash of pale, freezing gray. Inside her 60-story penthouse in Tribeca, Vivienne had not slept a single minute. She sat on a sprawling Menotti sofa, wrapped in a cashmere throw, her laptop burning hot against her knees. The taste of vintage champagne had long since turned sour in her mouth, replaced by the bitter ash of profound guilt. On her screen were the internal employment logs of Hudson and Gable. She had bypassed her own HR department, using her administrator credentials to access the buried files of the Apex Holdings acquisition. There it was, Felix Pendelton, lead structural engineer. Vivienne opened his portfolio, her eyes scanning the complex architectural blueprints and stress test models. She was not an engineer, but her brilliance lay in recognizing efficiency and innovation. Felix was not just an employee. He was a visionary. His patents detailed a revolutionary load transfer system that allowed massive, heavy robotic sorting tracks to be installed in century-old brick buildings without compromising their foundations. She opened the corresponding Omnicore file to see what her R&D department had done with Felix's life's work. What she found made her blood run cold. Omnicore wasn't using Felix's patents. Her chief operating officer, a ruthless man named Gregory, had deemed Felix's retrofitting method too slow for their aggressive Q1 expansion timeline. Instead, Gregory had buried Felix's patents to prevent competitors from using them and opted for a cheaper, faster steel reinforcement method, one that passed safety regulations by a razor-thin margin but sacrificed long-term structural integrity. They hadn't just fired Felix, they had killed his innovation purely to eliminate it from the market. Vivienne closed the laptop, a wave of nausea washing over her. She had built Omnicore on the principles of efficiency and progress. She had believed she was a builder, but looking at the cold, hard data, she realized she had become the very thing she despised, a corporate parasite. She had ruined a good man, forced a little girl out of her home, and buried superior technology, just to save a fraction of a percent on a quarterly earnings report. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and dialed Gregory's number. It was barely 6 a.m. on a holiday morning, a time when most of the city was still asleep after the New Year's celebrations. The call connected almost immediately. Gregory answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep but instantly focused. "Vivienne," he said, already sounding alert. "Happy New Year. Is there a crisis?" "There is," Vivienne replied, her voice as cold and brittle as cracking ice. She didn't waste a second on pleasantries. "The Hudson and Gable acquisition. The retrofitting patents we obtained from their lead engineer. Pendleton." She paused, her grip tightening around the phone. Why have they been sitting on a shelf instead of being implemented? A heavy pause hung on the line. "Vivienne, we discussed this in November. The Pendleton framework requires a 6-month installation phase. We needed the Brooklyn and Newark drone hubs operational by March. We went with the standard reinforced joist model. You bought a company for its IP, fired its entire staff, and then threw the IP in the garbage to use a cheaper, inferior method," she stated, the venom evident in her tone. "We eliminated a potential competitor and secured market dominance," Gregory countered, sounding defensive. "It was the mathematically sound decision. You signed off on the liquidation yourself." "I signed off on a spreadsheet, Gregory, not a massacre of innovation." Vivienne hung up without another word. She stood up, pacing the expanse of her living room. She couldn't undo the acquisition. The legal machinery was already locked in, but she could not let Felix Pendelton fade into poverty while she sat in a $60 million apartment. She had to fix this, but she couldn't simply hand him a check. A man with his pride, especially after learning who she was, would throw it in her face. She needed to give him his dignity back. By noon, Vivienne had formulated a plan. She contacted a boutique, independent architectural consulting firm in Soho, a firm Omnicore frequently used as a blind proxy for exploratory projects. She instructed the managing partner to immediately reach out to Felix Pendelton with a lucrative freelance contract. The project, designing a specialized, high-stress internal retrofit for a massive, derelict warehouse in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The compensation would be enough to pay for a year's rent in Park Slope, with a massive bonus upon completion. It was a phantom project, entirely funded from Vivienne's personal accounts. But Felix would never know. At 3 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Vivienne, it's Felix. From last night. I know it's crazy, but you won't believe the day I'm having. A firm just offered me the biggest consulting gig of my life. I think you brought me luck." Vivienne stared at the glowing screen. A small, painful smile touched her lips. She typed back, "That is wonderful news. Felix, you deserve it. Let's get coffee this week to celebrate." The coffee shop in Long Island City was a far cry from Jean-Georges. It smelled of burnt espresso and wet wool, and the radiator clanked violently in the corner. Vivienne sat in a cracked vinyl booth, wearing an understated trench coat and a simple cashmere turtleneck, consciously leaving her Cartier watch in her jewelry box. The bell above the door jingled, and Felix walked in. He looked like a different man. The heavy exhaustion that had anchored him to the floor on New Year's Eve was gone, replaced by a crackling, nervous energy. He spotted her and smiled, a genuine, eye-crinkling grin that made Vivienne's heart do a strange, treacherous flutter. "I still can't believe it," Felix said, sliding into the booth across from her and immediately pulling out a thick roll of blueprints. "The firm is called Vanguard Architecture. They want me to design a structural skeleton for a massive warehouse in the Navy Yard. The client wants to install heavy robotics on the upper floors, and they need a custom load-bearing solution. It's exactly what I specialize in." "That sounds incredible." Vivienne lied smoothly, taking a sip of her mediocre black coffee. "Who is the client?" "They're keeping it confidential for now. NDAs and all that." Felix waved a hand dismissively. "But the firm said the client's liaison wants to meet with me next week to go over the preliminary sketches. I'm telling you, Vivienne, this gig changes everything. I can move Mia back to a decent school district." Vivienne felt a tightening in her chest. "I'm so happy for you, Felix." Truly, over the next 3 weeks, Vivienne lived a dangerous double life. By day, she was the ice-cold billionaire CEO, navigating a brutal proxy fight with a rival logistics board and fending off Gregory's growing suspicions about her sudden interest in the Brooklyn Navy Yard properties. By evening, she was simply Vivienne, the supply chain manager who frequently met Felix for cheap takeout and reviewed his sketches, offering layman advice that mysteriously aligned perfectly with what a robotics-heavy warehouse would need. She found herself making excuses to visit his small Queens apartment. She helped Mia with her math homework at the tiny kitchen table, while Felix cooked pasta. She learned that Mia had a fierce allergy to peanuts, that Felix listened to vintage jazz when he was stressed, and that his ex-wife had walked out on Christmas Eve 2 years ago, leaving a permanent scar of abandonment on them both. Vivienne was terrified. She was falling in love, not just with Felix, but with the chaotic, warm, and brilliantly real life he and Mia shared. Her penthouse began to feel like a tomb. The turning point came on a Tuesday night in late January. Felix had hit a wall with his design. The blueprints were spread across his living room floor, and he was running his hands through his hair in frustration. "It's not working," Felix muttered, staring at a stress load calculation. "The weight of the automated sorting arms on the 3rd floor is too much for the existing masonry. The only way to support it is to use the patent I designed at Hudson and Gable, the one the conglomerate stole and buried." Vivienne, sitting cross-legged on the rug beside him, froze. "Can't you design a workaround?" "A workaround means compromising safety, or using cheap steel that will buckle in 10 years, Felix said, fiercely. "I won't do it. My name is going on this design. I need those patents. But they belong to the company that bought your firm," Vivienne said carefully, her pulse accelerating. "You can't use them." "I know," Felix said, his jaw setting with determination. "That's why I'm going to go to them. Omnicore Global. That's the monster that swallowed my firm. I'm going to go to their headquarters and petition their legal department to license my own patents back to me for this one project. Vanguard has the budget to pay for the license." "Felix, no," Vivienne blurted out, panic bleeding into her voice. "You can't do that. Omnicore is... They're a massive machine. You're a single freelancer. They'll crush you in legal fees just for asking. They won't meet with you." Felix looked at her, his hazel eyes softening, mistaking her panic for concern for his well-being. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. His palm was warm, calloused, and perfectly solid. "I have to try, Viv," he said softly. "This project is my second chance. It's Mia's future. I'm not going to let a bunch of faceless corporate vampires stop me from doing the best work of my life. I've already sent the email. I have a meeting with one of their mid-level directors tomorrow at noon." Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. She stared at his hand resting over hers. The charade was imploding. If Felix walked into Omnicore headquarters, he would see her face on the digital screens in the lobby. he would realize she wasn't just a friend. She was the head vampire. "Okay," Vivienne whispered, her mind racing desperately for a way to intercept the meeting, to stop him from discovering the truth before she could explain it herself. Wednesday morning at Omnicore Global was a storm of activity. Vivienne sat in her office, staring blindly at the Bloomberg terminal. She had secretly looked up Felix's appointment. He was scheduled to meet with Marcus Thorne, a junior director in acquisitions, on the 42nd floor. Vivienne knew what she had to do. She had to intercept Felix before he reached the security turnstiles. She would meet him in the lobby, pull him aside, and finally confess everything. She would offer to give him the patents back, free of charge, and beg for his forgiveness. At 11:45 a.m., Vivienne left her office and took the private elevator down to the grand marble-clad lobby of the 157 tower. The space was cavernous, buzzing with executives, couriers, and security personnel. She stood near the visitor reception desk, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. 11:50 a.m., 11:55 a.m. Felix did not appear. At 12:05 p.m., Vivienne's phone buzzed. It was a message from David, her assistant. "Ms. Croft, Gregory requested a sudden structural review meeting on the 42nd floor regarding the Brooklyn drone hubs. He asked me to pull the old Hudson and Gable files. Should I bring them to him?" Ice flooded Vivienne's veins. "Gregory, why was the chief operating officer looking into Hudson and Gable today?" She didn't text back. She sprinted toward the executive elevator, slamming her keycard against the reader and pressing the button for the 42nd floor. The ascent felt like an eternity. When the doors parted, she power-walked down the glass-paneled corridor toward the acquisitions conference rooms. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass of Conference Room B, she saw them. Felix was sitting at a large mahogany table, his blueprints spread out before him. Standing opposite him was not the junior director, but Gregory himself, looking impeccably smug in a tailored navy suit. Gregory was holding a copy of Felix's Vanguard architecture proposal. Vivienne reached the heavy glass door, just as Gregory spoke, his voice carrying through the slight gap in the doorway. "It's a very impressive proposal, Mr. Pendelton," Gregory was saying, a cruel, razor-thin smile on his lips. "But I'm afraid you've stumbled into a rather amusing conflict of interest. You see, this Vanguard architecture project you're working on, it's a phantom contract. The Brooklyn Navy Yard warehouse is owned by a shell corporation." Felix frowned, confusion crossing his face. "I don't understand. What does that have to do with licensing my patents?" "It means, Mr. Pendelton, that your client isn't Vanguard," Gregory said smoothly, tossing the file onto the table. "Your client is Omnicore. You've been hired by a proxy to fix a building that we own, and frankly, I find it highly irregular." Felix froze. "Omnicore hired me. Why would you fire me, bury my patents, and then secretly hire me through a proxy firm?" Gregory let out a dry, condescending laugh. "I didn't hire you. I would never authorize such an inefficient waste of capital. No, this little charity project was funded entirely off the books by our CEO. It seems she took a sudden, highly unprofessional personal interest in your welfare after liquidating your firm." Felix's face drained of color, the confidence he had worn only moments earlier vanishing completely. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his eyes fixed on Gregory as if hoping he had misheard. "Your CEO?" he repeated, his voice unsteady. "Yes," Gregory replied calmly, turning toward the door as though the answer required no further explanation. Before he could take another step, his gaze settled on a figure standing silently in the corridor. Vivienne's hand rested on the glass door handle, her knuckles white with tension, her face pale with unmistakable terror. Gregory's smile slowly widened. "Ah," he said softly. "Speak of the devil." Felix turned, his hazel eyes locked onto Vivienne, through the glass. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. Vivienne pushed the door open, stepping into the conference room. "Felix," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." Felix looked at her. He looked at her bespoke Tom Ford suit, the security badge hanging from her lapel, and the undeniable aura of power that radiated from her in this building. Then, his eyes dropped to the blueprints on the table, the blueprints she had sat on his living room floor and reviewed with him while eating cheap lo mein. He put the pieces together in real time. The sudden freelance job, her inexplicable knowledge of logistics and warehousing, the way she had flinched when he talked about the conglomerate that destroyed his life. "You," Felix whispered, the word carrying a devastating weight. It wasn't spoken in anger, but in profound, shattered disbelief. "You're omnicore." "Felix, I didn't know it was you when we met," Vivienne said, taking a step toward him, tears finally breaking free and spilling down her cheeks. "I swear to you, I didn't know until that night at the restaurant. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't bear to lose you. I just wanted to fix it. I wanted to give you your life back." Felix stared at her, the warmth and trust that had grown between them completely eradicated, replaced by a cold, hollow betrayal. "Give me my life back," he echoed, his voice shaking. "You're the one who took it away. You took my job. You forced me out of my home. You broke my daughter's heart when we had to pack up her bedroom. I was just looking at a spreadsheet," Vivienne sobbed, the ironclad CEO finally breaking, reduced to a desperate woman. "It was just business. I didn't see the people behind the numbers. But I see you now. Please, Felix." Felix reached down and began rolling up his blueprints. His hands were trembling, but his movements were deliberate and final. "That's the problem with people like you, Vivienne," Felix said, not looking at her as he shoved the blueprints into his leather tube. "You think everything is just business? You think you can buy your way out of the destruction you cause? You bought my time. You bought my trust. You even bought my daughter a fake friendship." "It wasn't fake," Vivienne cried out, reaching for his arm. Felix flinched, pulling away from her touch as if she burned him. He slung the blueprint tube over his shoulder and walked toward the door. "Keep your money, Ms. Croft," Felix said, his voice dropping to a dead, empty whisper. "And keep your patents. I'll find another way to feed my kid." He walked out of the conference room, his footsteps echoing down the glass hallway. Vivienne stood frozen, the silence of the room crushing her. She had built a $3 billion empire, and in the span of 5 minutes, she had never felt more completely, utterly bankrupt. The silence in conference room B was deafening after the glass door clicked shut behind Felix. Vivienne stood frozen, the ghost of his presence lingering in the cold, conditioned air of the 157 tower. Gregory leaned against the mahogany table, adjusting his Rolex with an air of immense satisfaction. "Well," Gregory drawled, breaking the silence. "That was certainly dramatic. But frankly, Vivienne, it saves us a massive headache. Pendleton was a loose end. Now that he knows the proxy firm was a sham, he'll drop the project. We can proceed with the standard steel reinforcements at the Navy Yard facility and keep his patents buried where they belong. The Q1 earnings report will look spectacular." Vivienne turned slowly to face her chief operating officer. The tears on her cheeks had dried, leaving her skin tight and cold. The crushing despair that had paralyzed her moments ago was suddenly burning away, replaced by a terrifying, white-hot clarity. She had spent a decade building Omnicore Global into an unstoppable titan. She knew exactly how the machine worked, and she knew exactly how to dismantle it. "We are not proceeding with the steel reinforcements, Gregory," Vivienne said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that made the COO's smug smile falter. "And we are not burying the patents. Vivienne, be reasonable. You're emotional," Gregory scoffed, taking a step toward her. "You let a personal infatuation cloud your fiduciary duty to this company. If the board knew you were funneling corporate funds into a dummy corporation, just to date a laid-off engineer, if the board knew," Vivienne interrupted, taking a step closer until she was inches from Gregory's face, "that my COO actively suppressed superior, life-saving structural technology to shave 3% off a quarterly budget, risking catastrophic warehouse collapse and billions in liability, they would have you thrown in federal prison for criminal negligence." Gregory's face went completely pale. "You signed the acquisition papers. You're just as liable." "I am the CEO," Vivienne whispered, her eyes devoid of any hesitation. "I am Omnicore. And as of this exact second, I am declaring the Hudson and Gable acquisition a strategic failure." "David!" Her assistant, who had been hovering nervously in the glass corridor, pushed the door open, his eyes wide. "Yes, Ms. Croft, draft an emergency directive for the legal department," Vivienne commanded, not breaking eye contact with Gregory. "Omnicore is divesting the intellectual property acquired from Hudson and Gable. The load-bearing retrofitting patents are to be immediately transferred back to their original creator, Felix Pendelton, free and clear, permanently and irrevocably." "You can't do that!" Gregory shouted, finally losing his composure. "Those patents are valued at $80 million. You can't just give away corporate assets. I'll call an emergency board meeting. I'll have you removed for erratic behavior and breach of fiduciary duty before the market closes." "Call the board!" Vivienne challenged, turning on her heel and walking toward the door. "Tell them to meet me in the main boardroom in 1 hour. But know this, Gregory, I own 51% of the voting shares. I don't need their permission. I am doing this to save my soul, and if you stand in my way, I will make sure the Wall Street Journal receives a very detailed dossier on exactly how you've been cutting corners on federal defense contracts." For the next hour, the executive floor of Omnicore was a war zone. Phones rang incessantly. Corporate attorneys from Skadden, ARPs were hauled onto secure conference calls. The board of directors, mostly wealthy venture capitalists and hedge fund managers, screamed through the speakerphones, threatening lawsuits, injunctions, and SEC investigations. Through it all, Vivienne sat at the head of the long glass table, an island of absolute calm in the hurricane she had created. She was stripping away her own empire. Every signature she pressed onto the divestment documents effectively slashed her net worth by hundreds of millions of dollars. The company's stock was already beginning to slip as rumors of an executive civil war leaked to Bloomberg terminals across the city. But as she signed the final transfer deed, officially returning the life's work of 140 engineers back into the hands of Felix Pendelton, she felt a physical weight lift from her shoulders. She was bleeding out financially, but for the first time in 10 years, she could breathe. You're a fool, Vivienne," Gregory spat, packing his briefcase furiously. "You're destroying your legacy for a man who won't even look at you. You'll be ousted by Friday. You won't just lose the company. You'll lose your billionaire status." Vivienne looked down at the Cartier watch on her wrist, then slowly unclasped it, leaving the heavy platinum timepiece on the glass table. A legacy built on other people's ruins isn't a legacy, Gregory. It's a crime scene, she said quietly. I'm done. The fallout was catastrophic and deeply public. By Wednesday of the following week, Forbes published an explosive article titled "The Meltdown of the Ice Queen: How Vivienne Croft Dismantled Her Own Empire." The Omnicore board, backed by minority shareholders, launched a massive lawsuit against her to protect the divestment of Felix's patents and ensure they could never be legally reclaimed by the company. Vivienne struck a brutal plea deal with the board. She would step down as CEO, surrender her controlling voting shares, and forfeit her severance package. In the span of 14 days, Vivienne Croft went from being the most powerful woman in global logistics to a corporate pariah. Her net worth plummeted as she was forced to liquidate her personal stock to cover the massive legal penalties and the operational costs of Vanguard architecture, ensuring Felix and his crew were fully paid for the Navy Yard project, even though Omnicore had abandoned it. She packed up her 60-story penthouse in Tribeca, selling the Minotti furniture and the modern art. She leased a modest one-bedroom walk-up apartment in Astoria, Queens. It had creaky hardwood floors, a radiator that clanked just like the one in the coffee shop, and a view of a brick alleyway. Sitting on a cheap IKEA sofa, surrounded by cardboard boxes, Vivienne drank tea from a chipped mug. Her phone, which used to ring 200 times a day with calls from senators and foreign dignitaries, was entirely silent. She was completely alone. But as she looked at her reflection in the dark window pane, she didn't see the hollow, terrified woman who had begged for a table at Jean-Georges. She saw someone real, miles away. In a brightly lit office in Brooklyn, Felix Pendelton was staring at a thick manila envelope that had just been delivered by a private courier. The return address read, Skadden, Arps, Slate, Mager and Flom, LLP. Felix hesitated. The last 2 weeks had been a blur of anger and confusion. He had thrown himself completely into the Navy Yard project, determined to finish the design purely out of spite, to prove he didn't need Vivienne Croft's charity. But when he opened the heavy envelope, the breath was knocked out of his lungs. Inside was the official deed of transfer for every single patent Hudson and Gable had ever filed. They hadn't just been licensed to him, they had been legally transferred into an irrevocable trust, naming Felix as the sole executor. Attached to the deed was a handwritten letter on simple white stationery. Felix, you were right. I thought everything was a transaction. I thought I could buy away my guilt. And in doing so, I insulted your pride, your talent, and your humanity. I cannot undo the pain I caused you and Mia, but I can give you back what is rightfully yours. These patents are yours. The Vanguard project has been fully funded in escrow. The money is yours to finish the build. I have stepped down from Omnicore. They can never touch you or your work again. You told me that big fish eat the little fish, and that CEOs don't see the people behind the numbers. You made me see. You made me want to be better. Thank you for the oyster, the brioche, and the drawing on the bridge. I will cherish them for the rest of my life. Goodbye, Felix, Vivienne. Felix's hands shook as he read the words. He turned on his computer and quickly typed Vivienne's name into the search bar. The headlines flooded his screen. Omnicore CEO ousted in bizarre IP giveaway. Vivienne Croft surrenders shares, steps down, amidst boardroom coup. The fall of the logistics billionaire. Felix sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. He had assumed her attempt to hire him was just a tax write-off, a rich woman's guilt manifesting as a temporary charity project. He had no idea she had gone to war for him. He had no idea she had detonated her own life's work, sacrificed her fortune, and destroyed her reputation, just to make things right. He looked at the bottom of his desk drawer. Sitting there, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, was Mia's crayon drawing of the 3 stick figures on the bridge. Felix grabbed his coat. It was late February, and a late-season snowstorm was rolling off the East River, blanketing the Brooklyn Navy Yard in a pristine layer of white. The massive warehouse, once a derelict shell, was now humming with activity. Inside, Felix's structural skeleton, a magnificent, intricate web of reinforced beams, stood proudly, supporting the heavy, automated machinery above without compromising a single historic brick. It was an engineering marvel. Vivienne stood outside the chain-link fence, the collar of her simple wool coat turned up against the biting wind. She had taken the subway for an hour just to see it from the outside. She didn't want to intrude. She just needed to see that it was real, that something beautiful had survived the wreckage of her career. She smiled, a quiet, tearful smile, watching the sparks from a welder's torch illuminate the massive windows. She turned to walk back toward the subway station, pulling her scarf tightly around her neck. You know, the load-bearing capacity on the 3rd floor exceeded our initial projections by 12%. Vivienne froze. The voice was deep, warm, and carried over the howling wind. She turned around, standing 10 yards away, bundled in a thick parka and a beanie, was Felix. His hazel eyes were bright, searching her face through the falling snow. Beside him, holding tightly to his hand, was Mia. She was wearing bright yellow snow boots and a matching puffer jacket, but Vivienne could see the faint sparkle of a plastic tiara tucked under her winter hat. "Felix," Vivienne breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs just as it had on New Year's Eve. Felix walked toward her, closing the distance between them. He looked at her worn coat, the absence of the Cartier watch, the lack of private security. He saw the woman who had sat on his rug and eaten takeout, the woman who had laughed at his daughter's jokes. "I read the news, Viv," Felix said quietly, stopping a few feet away. "I saw what you did, what you gave up." "It wasn't a sacrifice," Vivienne said, her voice shaking slightly in the cold. "It was a correction. The patents always belonged to you. You built this. I just finally got out of the way." "You didn't just get out of the way," Felix corrected softly. "You threw yourself on the grenade. You lost your company." "I don't miss it," Vivienne admitted, and to her surprise, she found it was entirely true. "I have a small apartment now. I make my own coffee. It's quiet, but it's a good quiet." Mia let go of her father's hand and trudged through the snow, stopping right in front of Vivienne. She looked up, her big brown eyes blinking away snowflakes. "We got a new apartment," Mia announced proudly. "It has a big window, and Daddy says I don't have to change schools anymore." Vivienne dropped to her knees in the snow, bringing herself to eye level with the little girl. Tears spilled over her lashes, hot and fast. "I am so happy to hear that, Mia. You deserve the biggest window in the world." Mia reached into her yellow puffer jacket pocket and pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper. It was a new drawing. This one was done in markers. It showed the massive Navy Yard warehouse. Standing in front of it were 3 stick figures. The tall one, the little one with the crown, and the one in the middle, holding both of their hands. "I made a new one," Mia said, handing it to Vivienne. "Daddy said we had to come find you to give it to you. He said we owed you a thank you." Vivienne took the drawing with trembling hands, pressing it to her chest as if it were the most valuable asset she had ever acquired. "Thank you," Sweetie, I love it. She stood up, wiping her eyes, and looked at Felix. He stepped closer, the space between them evaporating. He reached out, his warm, calloused hand gently brushing a snowflake from her cheek. "I was so angry," Felix whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't see past the betrayal, but I see you now, Vivienne. I see exactly who you are, and you don't have to be alone anymore." Vivienne looked into his eyes, the heavy armor of her past finally, completely shattering, leaving only a profound, terrifying hope. She didn't have billions of dollars, she didn't have a penthouse, and she didn't have a table at a Michelin-star restaurant. But as Felix pulled her into a fierce, warm embrace, shielding her from the winter wind, she knew she finally had a place to belong. The snow continued to fall over Brooklyn, burying the past and laying a clean, blank canvas for whatever came next. And that is how a woman who owned the world found out that true wealth isn't measured in stock options or luxury, but in the courage to risk everything for the people who truly matter. Vivienne lost her empire, but she gained a family, proving that sometimes the greatest victories look exactly like defeat. It's a powerful reminder that our past mistakes don't have to dictate our future, as long as we're brave enough to make things right. If this story touched your heart and kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder about the power of redemption, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life dramatic stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Vivienne's shoes? Let me know.